I remember the day we left real space because it was so painfully ordinary. The departure was logged at the third bell of the ship cycle, exactly as scheduled. The announcement crackled through the Vox grilles in the corridors, calm, formal, indifferent. Translation procedures initiated. All hands to assigned stations, non-essential personnel confined to quarters. The words had been spoken so many times across so many voyages that they barely registered anymore. They were ritual, not warning. I was a junior ratings clerk then, assigned to auxiliary records and ration tallies on the lower mid-decks. My duties that day were unremarkable: confirm crew manifests, reconcile supply counts, stamp departure forms already stamped twice by other offices that existed only to confirm that the first stamp had been applied correctly. The air smelled of oil and incense, as it always did before translation, and the deck plates vibrated with the low, steady thrum of engines preparing to scream reality apart. No one told us this voyage would be different. Why would they? The Imperium does not traffic in unnecessary information. Our destination was listed in the records, coordinates precise and meaningless to anyone below the command decks. Estimated travel time standard. Expected losses acceptable. Return date logged stamped. Approved. I remember pausing over that return date. Not because it troubled me, but because the ink had smudged slightly, forcing me to re-enter it on a secondary slate. I corrected it, sealed the entry and moved on. That date would never be seen again, though I did not know it then. When the translation alarms began to wail, they sounded wrong, not louder, just strained, as if the ship itself were reluctant. A shudder ran through the hull, stronger than usual, rattling teeth and loosening prayers from clenched throats. The lumen strips flickered. Somewhere above, I heard a servitor scream as its vocal unit overloaded, the sound cut off abruptly by a failsafe. We were already locked into the process. You cannot stop a translation once it has begun. That is doctrine. That is physics. That is faith. The bridge fell silent. I would learn later. Not because orders were not being given, but because no one knew which ones still applied. Chronometers spun, then froze. Data slates spat hieroglyphs before going dark. The comforting pressure of reality peeled away, replaced by something thick and suffocating, like breathing through soaked cloth. I dropped to my knees when the first wave hit. Everyone did, whether they admitted it or not. Gravity lurched sideways. The walls groaned. I felt something press against my thoughts, testing them, tasting them. I bit my tongue hard enough to bleed, and recited the litany of safe passage as drilled, each word precise, mechanical, empty of comfort. The screaming started seconds later, not from one place, but from everywhere at once. Crew, servitors, machinery, all voices layered into a single rising sound of panic and strain. Then, just as abruptly, it stopped. The alarms cut out. The engines continued their scream, but now it was distant, muted, as if heard through layers of insulation that had not existed moments before. We were in the warp. That realization did not come as terror. It came as confusion. The warp was dangerous, yes, but it was also familiar. Ships entered it every day and emerged intact, if shaken. This was not unprecedented. This was simply delayed. Orders came through the Vox after a long, unsettling pause. Calm voices, too calm, instructing us to remain at stations, to continue duty cycles, to trust in the Emperor and the ship's sacred mechanisms. The chapels rang their bells, priests chanting litanies of endurance, their voices echoing through ducts and conduits. Routine reasserted itself like a reflex. I returned to my station and tried to log the translation. The system refused the entry. Error codes cascaded across the slate, dates overlapping, times contradicting themselves. I flagged the issue for review and moved on to the next task, because that is what you do when procedure fails. You escalate, you record, and you continue. Hours passed, or days, or something that felt like both and neither. The first sign that something was truly wrong came when the return date vanished, not erased, not crossed out, simply absent. I noticed it while reconciling manifests again, double checking for discrepancies. The field where the return date should have been was blank. No error code, no warning glyph, just an empty space where certainty had once lived. I reported it. The response came back stamped and impersonal: data corruption likely. Continue standard operations, so we did. The ship did not emerge from the warp, Translation cycles extended beyond projected limits. Chronometers disagreed violently, some advancing, others stalling. One officer aged a decade in what he swore was a week. Another did not age at all. We rotated duty shifts according to posted schedules that no longer aligned with any shared sense of time, but enforcement continued regardless. Missed shifts were punished. Late arrivals were logged as dereliction. Discipline does not care whether reality cooperates. I remember the bridge announcement that followed, voice strained now, layered with static. The captain informed us that navigation had encountered anomalies. That corrective action was underway, that faith and duty would see us through. The words were correct. The tone was not. Behind the formality, something else crept in. Omission. No mention of how long the correction would take. No reassurance of eventual emergence. The silence between sentences stretched just a fraction too long. That was when I realized the return date had not merely been lost. It had been rendered irrelevant. In the days or cycles that followed, subtle changes spread through the ship. Sounds echoed longer than they should. Corridors felt longer, angles slightly wrong. Some doors opened onto spaces that had not been there before, then refused to open again when reported. Still, the records continued. I continued. I logged rations. I stamped manifests. I recorded crew casualties, minor at first, accidents attributed to stress and machinery failure. Each death entered cleanly into the system. Assigned a time and date that meant nothing outside the page. At night, when I slept, I dreamed of falling through endless corridors lined with filing cabinets. Each drawer labeled with names that blurred when I tried to read them. I would wake with the taste of dust in my mouth, and the sense that something had brushed past me while I slept. No one spoke openly about being lost. That word was too imprecise, too emotional. Instead, officers spoke of delay, of extended transit, of exceptional circumstances. The Imperium has a phrase for everything, and those phrases form a cage strong enough to hold panic at bay, for a time. But the records did not lie. No return date was ever re-entered. No estimated emergence was approved. The voyage continued, logged as ongoing, unremarkable in its persistence. The ship's manifest still listed us as en route, as if movement itself were a destination. That was the first lesson the warp taught us. You can leave real space without ever arriving anywhere else. And once the return is omitted, no amount of duty will bring it back. Time did not break like a chain snapping. If it had, we might have noticed immediately. We might have panicked properly, collapsed into screaming honesty, demanded impossible answers from officers who did not have them. A clean break is a mercy. You can point at it and say, there is the moment the world stopped obeying. But time did not break cleanly. It spoiled. At first it was only paperwork. The chronometers in my section began disagreeing by small margins, seconds, then minutes. A wall-mounted dial would tick forward while my slate's internal clock lagged behind, the difference too minor to matter until it was written down. In the administratum, if it is written down it becomes reality, so I wrote it down. I flagged the discrepancy. I submitted Form 40K temporal instrument irregularity, minor or non-critical. The response was stamped and returned within the same cycle. Investigate at next scheduled maintenance. Continue duty schedule. We continued. The ship's routine is a creature of habit more stubborn than any flesh. It does not care what the warp does outside the hull. Bells still rang. Duty shift still rotated. Rations were still issued in measured scoops, each tin stamped with production codes older than most of the crew. The chapels still held their services at prescribed hours, priests chanting litanies that sounded increasingly like pleading when the walls groaned too long. Then the watches began to overlap. I noticed it when 2 work gangs arrived at my clerk station claiming the same shift assignment. They argued in hushed voices, afraid to raise a commotion, each holding identical schedule slips issued from the same office. Their slips were properly sealed. Their signatures were correct. Their times were identical. One of them was late by 7 minutes, if you believed his chronometer. The other insisted he was early by 13. Both were right according to their own instruments. Both were wrong according to mine. I did what doctrine demands when doctrine cannot reconcile itself. I requested clarification from above. The clarification never came. Instead, a supervisor arrived, A pallid man with ink, stained fingers and a face already resigned to a lifetime of filing anomalies. He did not solve the problem. He simply applied procedure. Both gangs work, he said. Double coverage ensures efficiency. But, one Ganger began. The supervisor raised his seal stamp like a weapon. The Ganger shut his mouth, so both gangs worked. One collapsed from exhaustion before the shift ended. The other finished, then was punished the next cycle for failing to report to an assignment that had also overlapped. That was when I began to understand time was no longer a shared truth. It was a resource, and like all resources aboard an imperial vessel, it would be rationed by authority whether it existed or not. The rot spread quickly after that. Duty shifts repeated. I do not mean similar shifts. I mean the same shift, same tasks, same roster, the same names stamped into the schedule, appearing again as if the paper itself had forgotten it was already used. Men reported to posts they had manned the day before, then were ordered back again after a rest period that lasted either minutes or a whole day, depending on which clock you trusted. Some crew began aging faster. It was not dramatic at first. A man's hair graying over a few cycles. A woman's hands wrinkling and thinning as if years had passed while she stood at her station. They tried to hide it, rubbing dye into their hair, keeping gloves on, avoiding Medicare bays where questions might lead to uncomfortable attention. Others did not age at all. A deck runner named Jaw designation J-19, always smiling, always quick, remained unchanged while the officers around him grew gaunter and more brittle. I saw him years later, if years is what it was, still running the same corridors with the same childish bounce, eyes bright, skin unlined. People began to whisper that he had been blessed. Others whispered he had been marked. Both were possible. Both were equally useless. The administratum schedules posted on bulkheads became meaningless but were still enforced. That is the part that still makes my throat tighten when I think of it. It was not the warp's cruelty that broke us first. It was our insistence on pretending it could be managed with stamps and bells. We posted new schedules constantly, trying to reconcile time drift. Old ones were torn down, burned, replaced. Each new schedule was countersigned by an officer who looked more exhausted than the last. Each schedule was followed faithfully for a while, until the clocks diverged again, until two bells rang at once, until men began arriving to posts at times that could not coexist. Punishments increased, late reporting, early reporting, failure to report, reporting twice, reporting to the wrong post because the corridor itself had shifted slightly between cycles. Every infraction was logged and disciplined, because discipline was the only thing the ship's command still felt it could control. I was promoted, in a way, not formally, no ceremony, but my workload grew, more forms, more anomaly reports, more duty roster corrections. The supervisor began sending problems directly to my station because I was reliable and detailed, which in truth meant I did not scream openly when confronted with impossible contradictions. I began to feel time like a physical pressure. It pressed in the corridors, thick as humidity. It clung to my skin, making the air feel heavy, as if the ship was sunk underwater. There were moments where moving from one compartment to another felt like wading through syrup, each step delayed by something intangible. Then there were moments where time slipped. I would blink and find myself on the other side of a corridor, unsure how I crossed it. I would sit to complete a manifest entry and look up to see my ink dry and cracked as if hours had passed. A candle in the chapel would burn down in a breath. A pot of recaf would stay steaming for an entire shift without cooling. Once, I watched a servitor's quill scratch across parchment in a perfect loop, writing the same line over and over until the page tore from repeated pressure. When I reported it, the supervisor stamped the report and returned it. Servitor malfunction. Replace at next scheduled maintenance. There was no next scheduled maintenance. Not truly. Maintenance crews came and went, their rosters corrupted like everything else. Some claimed they had repaired the chronometers. Others insisted they had not yet been assigned the task. The ship continued its routines long after sense had abandoned them. That became our theology, not spoken aloud, but practiced. Routine became our substitute for reality. When time rotted, we did not adapt. We clung harder to what was written, as if ink could anchor the universe. The chapels grew more crowded. People prayed not for salvation but for predictability. They begged for the bells to ring only once. They begged for the same day to mean the same thing for everyone. Priests responded with doctrine and procedural hymns, reminding us that the emperor's order was eternal, that the warp was a test, that endurance was worship. Some believed. Others simply mouthed the words, because the alternative was to admit we were adrift in a place where centuries could pass in a heartbeat. I began to suspect that the ship itself was changing us, not just through aging or stasis, but through the slow grinding erosion of shared time. Without a common clock, we began to lose common truth. Conversations became arguments. Memories became unreliable. When someone said, "yesterday," you had to ask which yesterday they meant. Then the first child was born who had never seen real space. Her mother came to my clerk's station to register the birth, hands trembling, eyes wide with exhaustion. The form required a date and time. She stared at the blank fields for a long time, then whispered, "Which clock do I use?" I did not have an answer, so I chose one for her. I stamped it official, and in that moment, I felt the weight of it. Time was not merely rotting. It was being manufactured by clerks like me, assigned through necessity, made real by seal and signature. We were not measuring time anymore. We were filing it into existence. The first generation born aboard was treated as an error, not officially, of course. The Imperium does not acknowledge mistakes unless they can be weaponized or corrected through punishment. On paper, the births were logged as unexpected demographic events, their causes attributed to extended transit conditions and morale management failures. New ration projections were calculated. New sleeping allocations drafted. The system adjusted without ever asking whether it should. Children cried in maintenance corridors long before command admitted what was happening. There was nowhere else to put them. Crew quarters had been designed for rotation, not permanence. Bunks stacked 3 high were already full, bodies sleeping in shifts to maximize space. So infants were born in storerooms, in unused chapels, in the dead space between bulkheads where pipes ran warm enough to keep a body alive. Midwives were improvised from medica staff who had never planned to deliver anything but death notices. I logged the births. That became my duty. Among others, crew designation numbers were extended, suffixes added to indicate lineage. Not names. Names were inefficient, but functional identifiers tied to future eligibility. The child of a deckhand became probationary deckhand. The child of a clerk like me was earmarked for records or logistics, their fate written before they could speak. Lineage became paperwork, supplies dwindled, but manpower was never allowed to rest. That was the doctrine command adopted once the reality of permanence could no longer be denied. Ration sizes were reduced in increments too small to provoke revolt. Protein blocks were diluted. Water recycling thresholds tightened. Entire shifts were extended under the justification of operational necessity. Exhaustion was logged as a disciplinary concern rather than a medical one. You could always work a body harder. I watched children grow up measuring time not in days, but in alarms and bells that no longer agreed with one another. They learned to navigate the ship by instinct, by smell, by the subtle tilt of corridors that no longer aligned to original schematics. They played games in the dark, inventing rules about which shadows were safe and which were not. Their parents taught them duty before reading. A child who could not recite their assigned function by their 5th cycle, however cycles were counted that year, was marked for corrective instruction. Corrective instruction often meant labor. Small hands fit easily into narrow access shafts. Small bodies required fewer rations. The logic was unassailable. I saw a boy replace his grandfather at a cogitator station. The grandfather had worked that post since before translation. I remembered stamping his original assignment papers, neat and confident. When his hands finally shook too badly to input commands accurately, he was reassigned to lighter duty and died 2 cycles later, heart failure logged cleanly. The boy took his seat the same day, same designation amended suffix, same duty hours, same machine that hummed and clicked and demanded constant attention. He was proud. I could see it in the way he straightened his back, mimicking a posture he had watched his entire life. He never asked why the ship had not arrived anywhere. By then, no one did. We stopped talking about destination entirely. The cargo holds were empty or repurposed into housing. The original mission profile became a footnote buried beneath centuries of appended addenda. The ship no longer carried anything except itself and us. We were no longer transporting anything. We were what was being carried. I began to see it in the manifests. Crew numbers stabilized not because losses stopped, but because births matched deaths closely enough to maintain equilibrium. It was a closed system now, grimly efficient. Every death freed rations and space. Every birth consumed them. The administratum loves balance sheets. Family names vanished, not by decree, but by irrelevance. When your entire life is lived aboard a vessel that never arrives, ancestry loses meaning beyond function. Children introduced themselves by designation and duty track. Romantic attachments were discouraged unless approved for population control purposes. Love was tolerated only when it aligned with manpower needs. I married once. That is what the records say, at least. A union approved to stabilize morale within the clerical cohort. We shared a bunk for overlapping shifts and spoke in low voices about things that no longer existed. Skies, wind, open space. She died during a maintenance breach when a sealed deck depressurized without warning. Her death was logged as acceptable attrition. I stamped the form myself because there was no one else available that cycle. Children born aboard grew into something different. They were quieter, more watchful. They learned early that the ship punished curiosity. They knew which corridors changed and which stayed stable. They avoided looking too long into reflective surfaces where their own faces sometimes seemed delayed. I overheard a child ask once, "Are we real space people or ship people?" The adult did not answer. I began to notice something else too, something the records could not quite capture. The ship responded differently to those born aboard. Bulkheads opened more readily for them. Systems glitched less often in their presence. Some claimed to hear the engines whispering, not in words but in reassurance. I flagged these reports as stress-induced hallucinations, because that is what procedure required. But the pattern persisted. Those born after the translation adapted better to the rot of time. They accepted overlapping days, contradictory schedules, aging that did not match calendars. To them, this was not corruption. It was normal. I, on the other hand, remembered real space. That memory became a liability. I remembered sunlight. I remembered gravity that did not groan. I remembered clocks that agreed with one another and days that ended. Those memories hurt more than the hunger or the exhaustion. They were proof of something we no longer had and might never see again. The ship did not want us to remember. I cannot explain that statement in technical terms, but it is true nonetheless. The longer we stayed, the more the past faded. Records degraded. Data corruption spread selectively, erasing references to before the translation while preserving duty logs with obsessive clarity. The past became myth. The present became routine. The future ceased to exist beyond the next shift. Entire generations lived and died without ever questioning the absence of arrival. For them, the ship was the universe. Its walls were the horizon. Its alarms were weather. Its cruelty was simply the way things were. I continued to log births and deaths, ink dried. Stamps struck. Lives entered and exited the manifest with brutal efficiency. Somewhere deep in the ship, something shifted and breathed and listened, and we fed it with our routine without ever naming it. We had become cargo, living, aging, breeding cargo, carried not toward a destination but through something vast and patient that had no reason to let us go. And the ship, our god-machine prison, drifted on, full of people who had never known anything else, sustaining itself by turning generations into maintenance parts. The chapels were never meant to operate like this. They had been designed for pause, for moments between duties when a crew member could kneel, recite the proper litanies, and feel briefly aligned with something greater than the ship's endless hunger for labor. A chapel was supposed to close, its candles guttering out as the cycle bell rang and people returned to their posts. Ours never closed. Red alert became the default state so gradually that no one could point to the moment it began. The klaxons rang so often that silence itself became suspicious. At first, alerts meant hull stress or navigation instability. Later, they meant nothing at all, just another signal that the ship required vigilance, obedience, fear. The chapels adapted. Candles were replaced constantly, wax pooling in thick, layered drifts on the stone floors until the surfaces became slick and treacherous. Incense burned day and night, the air so thick with it that breathing felt like inhaling grit. Vox, grilles mounted in the walls whispered hymns on endless loop, overlapping tempos creating a droning, maddening chorus that seeped into dreams and followed us back to our workstations. Prayer and panic became indistinguishable. I attended services because attendance was mandatory during non-duty cycles. We all did. Clerks, laborers, officers, rank meant nothing before the altar, except who stood closer to the front and who was allowed to leave sooner. We knelt shoulder to shoulder, bodies packed tight, the heat of so many people mixing with the scent of fear, sweat and incense until the air felt alive. The priests' voices were hoarse from overuse. They recited doctrine with absolute precision, every word memorized, every gesture exact. Deviation was unthinkable. Faith, like everything else aboard, had become procedural. A failure to pray correctly was a failure to comply, and failure to comply was a failure of loyalty. At first, faith intensified. People prayed harder, longer, louder. They begged for safe passage, for an end to the delay, for the emperor to notice us again. Some brought scraps of metal, broken tools, anything they believed might serve as an offering. The altar overflowed with meaningless tokens, each one heavy with desperation. Then faith fractured. Different interpretations took root in different decks. Some claimed the warp was a test, that our endurance was proof of worthiness. Others whispered that the ship had been chosen, removed from the Imperium's sight to fulfill some unknowable purpose. A few, quickly silenced, suggested that the Emperor had abandoned us, or worse, never knew we were gone. Command responded swiftly. Unauthorized prayer groups were declared heretical. Improvised shrines were dismantled. Individuals who spread doctrinally unsound interpretations were detained, interrogated, and, when necessary, executed. The paperwork for these executions was immaculate, forms stamped, reasons cited, witnesses recorded. Faith was permitted only in approved forms. I was required to log chapel attendance alongside duty rosters. I tracked who attended, who lingered too long, who skipped services claiming exhaustion or conflicting assignments. Patterns emerged. Those who questioned too openly vanished. Their absence was noted, then absorbed into the ship's ever-growing ledger of acceptable losses. I prayed because it was required, not because I believed I was heard. Kneeling on cold stone, knees aching, back hunched, I recited the words as drilled. I felt nothing, no comfort, no reassurance, just the oppressive presence of the ship around us, its bulk pressing in from every side. The warp outside the hull felt closer than the Emperor ever did, an unseen pressure that listened without judgment. Sometimes, during prayers, the lights would flicker, not like a malfunction, more like hesitation. Shadows would stretch unnaturally along the walls, and the chanting would briefly fall out of sync, voices slipping over one another in ways that made my skin crawl. Priests never acknowledged it. They raised their voices, pushing harder, as if volume alone could drown out whatever pressed close. I saw a priest break once. He was old, his robes threadbare, his voice worn thin from endless recitation. Mid-chant, he stopped, just stopped. His eyes widened, fixed on something above the altar that no one else could see. "They are listening," he whispered. Handlers moved instantly. He was dragged away before he could say more, his words swallowed by the chant resuming without pause. The next service was led by a younger priest who spoke with absolute confidence. The broken one's name was removed from the roster. His designation was reassigned. We learned not to ask. Executions increased during that period. Not public ones, not yet, but quiet removals conducted inside corridors and sealed compartments. The official charge was always the same: preservation of doctrinal purity. In truth, it was preservation of order. Faith that asked questions was dangerous. Faith that adapted without authorization was worse. I stamped the execution forms. My hands shook the first time. They stopped shaking after that. The chapels became places of fear rather than solace. People attended not to seek comfort, but to avoid suspicion. Prayer became another duty shift, another box to check. Those who prayed too fervently were watched. Those who prayed too little were punished. I noticed something else then, something subtle, almost imperceptible. The warp seemed to respond. I do not mean miracles or voices. I mean attention. The longer we prayed, the more the ship groaned during services. The more the alarms overlapped with hymns. Once, during a particularly fervent mass held during prolonged red alert, the ship's hull rang like a bell struck from the outside. The priests called it a test. I called it listening. I prayed less after that, though never openly. I mouthed the words, kept my head bowed, performed the gestures. Inside, I felt nothing but a growing certainty that whatever we were speaking to through these rituals was not what we believed it to be. But belief was not required. Compliance was. By then, children born aboard had begun attending chapel as naturally as reporting to duty. They learned the hymns as lullabies. They slept through alarms without waking. Faith, for them, was not comfort, it was atmosphere. The ship lived in a state of endless red alert, and so did we. Prayer did not save us. It did not guide us home. It simply kept us occupied, kneeling, chanting, while time rotted and the warp pressed closer. The Emperor became a distant abstraction, invoked out of habit rather than hope. The warp, meanwhile, listened patiently, and I began to suspect that it liked the sound of us praying. A ship is not a place, not truly. Not in the way a hive block or a shrine hall is a place. A void ship is a moving god machine, an arrangement of sacred systems that only pretends to be stable, because the crew bleeds themselves into its maintenance. In real space, that illusion holds long enough for voyages to end. In the warp, the illusion rots. At first, the failures were familiar. A coolant line rupturing in the lower engine bays, scalding steam turning a corridor into a killing fog. A cogitator bank seizing up under corrupted data feed, its servitor operators twitching as their implants tried to reconcile nonsense. A bulkhead door refusing to seal, forcing an entire section to be quarantined until repairs could be authorized. All of this would have been routine, dangerous, but expected, if we had been able to fix things properly. We could not. We could only delay. The tech adepts began speaking of the ship the way Medicus spoke of terminal patients, not in terms of repair, but in terms of stabilization. They conducted rites over failing systems with the same solemn precision priests used over dying men. Censers swung in oil-thick air, binary chants droned. Sacred unguents were smeared over cracked conduits as if oil could replace integrity. Endure, they whispered to the machines. The machines answered with groans. I worked clerical support for maintenance allocations by then. I filed repair requests, rationed replacement parts, stamped permissions to open sealed access panels. The sheer volume of requests would have overwhelmed any sane bureaucracy, but sanity was not a resource aboard our vessel. Every request had to be justified. Every repair required forms. Every form required signatures. Every signature required an officer whose time was already fractured by rotting clocks and endless alerts. So repairs became triage. We stopped asking, can this be fixed? We asked, is this worth the cost to fix? Whole decks were written off. It began with small sections, storage compartments, unused corridors, sealed behind heavy blast doors and marked with warning glyphs. The official reason was containment of contamination, mold, radiation, pressure instability. But everyone knew the truth beneath the stamped language. We didn't have the manpower to maintain everything anymore. Each sealed deck was a surrender, filed neatly in the ledger as acceptable attrition of infrastructure. The phrase is cold enough to cover anything. Sometimes, a sealed deck still held people. Work gangs trapped during a sudden lockdown. Families housed in abandoned quarters when space grew too tight. A chapel group praying too far from approved zones. When the doors sealed, their vox calls echoed for days, or minutes, or years, depending on which time you believed. The forms recorded their loss as incidental. I signed one once. Deck 17L sealed due to structural instability. Estimated occupants 43. Status unrecoverable. Follow-up actions none. My stamp made it official. I told myself it was necessary. The ship was failing in ways that couldn't be repaired, only postponed. The engine core became the heart of the rot. The great sacred reactors, machines so vast most crew only knew them as heat and vibration, began to fluctuate unpredictably. Power surges blew out lumen strips in entire corridors. Then, without warning, power would drop, leaving decks in darkness long enough for panic to bloom. The tech adepts performed emergency rites constantly, their voices raw from binary prayer. They patched lines with scrap. They substituted parts with less sacred alternatives. They cannibalized systems from sealed decks, hauling rusted machinery through corridors like scavengers stripping a corpse. They begged the engines to keep breathing. I saw a senior adept kneel before a control altar, his mechadendrites twitching nervously, and whisper, "Just one more cycle." His voice was not devotional. It was desperate. The ship lived, but only by shedding parts of itself. I learned this lesson the hard way when my own section was marked for reduction. The records vault where I worked, rows of paper archives and cogitator stacks, was declared non-essential. Digital redundancy existed, command insisted. The paper was a relic, useful but not worth the power draw or the maintenance crew needed to keep the humidity stable. We were given a notice stamped with final authority, relocate critical files within 3 cycles. Remaining materials to be sealed, 3 cycles. It could have been 3 hours or 3 months. Time meant nothing, but the stamp meant everything. We worked until our hands bled from hauling crates. Paper cuts became infected quickly in the ship's stale air. Servitors groaned under overload. We chose which records to save based not on importance, but on what we could carry before the doors shut. When the cycle ended, whenever it truly ended, the vault doors sealed. I stood outside them, breathing hard, listening to the locks engage with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Inside, countless records remained: births and deaths, duty rosters, prayer attendance logs, execution forms. The paper history of our slow decay entombed because ink was too expensive to preserve. That was when I understood survival aboard this ship was a constant act of abandonment. We did not fix. We sacrificed. We chose which sections of the god machine could be left to die so the rest might limp forward. We chose which people could be sealed away so manpower might be spent elsewhere. We chose which memories were worth saving and which could rot in darkness. The tech adepts called it resource optimization. The priests called it necessary trial. I called it what it was: slow dismemberment. And the ship seemed to accept it, almost as if it knew what it was doing, shedding weight the way a wounded beast sheds blood, without stopping, without caring. Just continuing because continuation is all it has left. In the deepest maintenance shafts, where the air was hot and metallic, and thick with the stink of old coolant, I once saw a wall weeping oil, not from a pipe, not from a seam, just seeping from stone and steel, as if the ship itself were sweating. A worker wiped it with his glove and stared at the black smear. "Is that normal?" he whispered. A tech adept looked at it for a long time before answering. "Do not ask that," he said. We stopped asking. We just kept patching, sealing, rerouting, sacrificing, keeping the dying god machine alive by feeding it pieces of itself. And with every sealed deck, every abandoned system, every name written off as acceptable attrition, the ship grew smaller, not physically, but spiritually. Its world narrowed until all that remained were the corridors still lit, the engines still breathing, and the people still listed as active crew. We lived inside a machine that was dying slowly in a place where time rotted, and our only worship was maintenance performed at gunpoint of necessity. The first message arrived while we were still pretending the schedule meant something. I was on duty in the newly consolidated records bay, half the size of the old vault, twice as crowded, the air perpetually warm from overworked cogitators. Lumen strips buzzed overhead, their light jaundiced and unreliable. Servitors shuffled between shelves with crates of stamped parchments, clutched to their chests like offerings. A vox chime sounded at my station, not the usual crackle of internal comms. This was sharper, clearer, the tone used for command-level transmissions. My stomach tightened immediately. Messages meant new duties, new punishments, new burdens no one wanted. The slate display flashed incoming vox directive, priority absolute. The sender designation was wrong, not unknown, familiar. It matched a command code from the ship's original departure roster. A captain's seal. An officer who, by all rational accounting, had been dead for centuries, if centuries was even a usable measure anymore. I stared at the code, expecting it to distort like so many other details did. It didn't. I opened the message. The voice that spilled into the bay was crisp, formal, and filled with the calm authority of someone who still believed the universe followed rules. "All hands," it said. "Prepare for arrival procedures. Translation complete within the next standard day. Docking protocols to commence upon emergence. Deviation from assigned roles will be punished as treason." The message ended with a seal stamp encoded into the Vox itself. For a moment, the bay was silent except for the hum of machinery. Then the clerks around me began murmuring. Some laughed, a thin, hysterical sound. Others crossed themselves. One woman began to cry quietly into her sleeve, shaking as if the message had struck her. Arrival procedures. We hadn't heard those words in, I didn't know how long. The phrase felt like a relic, something from old training manuals and long, degraded memories of real space. And yet here it was, delivered with perfect clarity, as if nothing had happened. The supervisor arrived within minutes, his face pinched with fatigue. He listened to the Vox record twice, then nodded once, as if confirming a calculation. "Log it," he said. "I managed. This directive is impossible." The sender, he cut me off with a raised seal stamp. "Log it," he repeated, voice harder. "Then forward to command." So I did. The directive was entered into the records, stamped, countersigned, and routed upward through channels that still existed only because we continued pretending they did. The paper trail was immaculate. The content was insanity. Command's response arrived later, not explanation, not reassurance, a simple stamped order of all units comply. Failure to obey constitutes dereliction. We followed it. Of course we did. Obedience aboard the ship was not a matter of belief. It was reflex. Even when orders contradicted reality, the act of following them was safer than the act of questioning. Questioning invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited removal. So the ship prepared for arrival that never came. Work crews scrubbed corridors that had been slick with oil for generations. Officers rehearsed docking protocols using schematics no longer accurate. Priests held special services, chanting hymns of gratitude and safe emergence, their voices cracking with forced joy. The children, those born aboard, ship people, watched with confusion. They had never seen real space. They did not understand why adults moved with frantic purpose, why the word arrival made people tremble. To them, this was just another cycle of madness, another procedural storm that would pass. For those of us who remembered before, it was worse. Hope is a dangerous thing in the warp. The next message came before the first cycle of arrival prep even ended. Another Vox directive, equally clear, equally formal. This one ordered combat readiness, describing an enemy engagement that, according to our current position, should have occurred decades ago, perhaps even before my birth. It referenced deck numbers we had sealed off long ago. It demanded troop movements through corridors that no longer existed. Command again responded with compliance. I watched the officers' faces as they received the message packets. They looked increasingly hollow, their eyes darting like trapped animals. They knew these orders could not be fulfilled. They also knew refusal was unthinkable. So they did what the Imperium does best. They reinterpreted, wrote through adjacent decks. They ordered, substitute available units, proceed as closely as possible to directive intent. Intent. That word became our lifeline. We obeyed the spirit of orders issued by voices that belonged to dead men. We followed directives older than memory because the chain of command demanded it, and the chain of command existed solely to prevent us from admitting we were lost beyond retrieval. Rank began to rot too. Officers appointed centuries ago still issued Vox commands. Some were repeated looping, as if the messages themselves were caught in a temporal eddy. Others arrived out of sequence, an after-action report delivered before the battle order, a commendation issued before the casualty list. The newer officers, the ones born aboard or promoted during our drift, tried to anchor authority through stamps and seals. They held tribunals over missed directives, punishing crews for failing to comply with instructions that arrived weeks late or referenced impossible circumstances. The paperwork remained perfect. Reality did not. I was ordered to compile a master index of valid directives. It was impossible. There was no way to determine validity when time itself was corrupted. Still, I compiled it because refusal was treason. I created categories: current, delayed, obsolete, contradictory. Each category filled quickly. Contradictory swallowed them all. Sometimes, while filing, I would catch myself wondering, what if these messages were not old at all? What if they were being sent now, from some point in time we could no longer align with? What if the ship was drifting not just through space, but through eras, brushing against its own past, like a corpse floating through a current? The thought made my skin crawl. The warp does not respect linearity. It does not respect sanity. It folds cause and effect together like paper and expects you to keep reading the creases. We continued to obey. Duty became a reflex divorced from purpose. That was the final transformation. At first, duty had meant something: service, survival, loyalty to a distant imperium. Now duty was simply the act of continuing, completing tasks because tasks existed, following orders because orders arrived, stamping forms because forms were demanded. We could no longer imagine arrival, so we focused on compliance. I obeyed orders older than memory, issued by a bureaucracy that no longer knew we existed. That truth settled like dust in my lungs. Somewhere, far beyond the warp, the Imperium's records likely showed our ship as missing, listed as lost in transit, written off as acceptable attrition. Entire worlds would have risen and fallen in the time we drifted. Administratum clerks in distant offices would have stamped our loss without ever knowing our faces. And yet, aboard this vessel, we still received orders, still filed reports, still behaved as if someone, somewhere, was watching. That was perhaps the most horrifying part, the possibility that the warp itself had become our audience, feeding us old commands like bait just to see us struggle to obey. I began to suspect that obedience was no longer a virtue. It was a trap. But traps still function as long as you keep stepping into them. And we did. The ship began to feel crowded, not in the way it had when bunks were stacked too tightly or when whole families slept in maintenance corridors. This was different. This was the sense of being observed from angles that should not exist, of sharing space with presences that did not need bodies or rations or manifests. Even when alone, I was never alone. It started with voices. Not the obvious kind, not screaming or chanting, not at first. These were quieter, intimate sounds. My name spoken softly from behind me when no one stood there. A familiar laugh echoing down a corridor long after its owner had been logged dead. At first I blamed exhaustion. Sleep deprivation had claimed sharper minds than mine. But then others began reporting the same thing. A deckhand swore his mother, dead for decades, had corrected his posture during a shift. A child insisted a voice from the walls had reminded her to attend chapel. A servitor paused mid-task and turned its head toward an empty space, Vox grill crackling as if receiving instruction from somewhere unlisted. The reports came to me. They always did. Anything that could not be neatly categorized eventually landed on a clerk's desk. I logged the incidents under environmental auditory hallucinations, stamped them provisional, and forwarded them upward. The responses were always the same: warp exposure effects, continue monitoring, maintain morale. That word had lost all meaning. Shadows began to linger. They did not move like normal shadows, obeying the flicker of lumen, strips, or the sway of swinging cables. These shadows clung to corners even when light shifted, stretching where they should not, compressing when observed directly. I caught one once in the reflection of a polished bulkhead, standing upright, shaped like a man unmoving. When I turned, it was gone. The vents whispered too. Not the mechanical hiss of airflow or the rattling of loose panels. These were syllables, breathy and almost affectionate, slipping through the ducts when the ship cycle dipped into what passed for night. I learned to keep my head down and my ears blocked with cloth when possible. Others were not so careful. Crew began to disappear, not in dramatic fashion, no alarms, no blood. They simply failed to report. Their bunks were found undisturbed, their duty stations empty, their last recorded locations unremarkable: corridor intersections, supply closets, chapel aisles. Their absence was noted. A line was added to the manifest. Status changed from active to unaccounted, rations redistributed, duties reassigned. The ship absorbed the loss without pause. I was ordered to audit these disappearances. The task was absurd. There were no patterns that fit within acceptable models. The missing came from every deck, every cohort, young and old, faithful and skeptical, those born aboard and those who remembered before. The only commonality was familiarity. Those who disappeared were people others spoke about often. People remembered. People whose names were used casually in conversation. It was as if remembrance itself had weight. That was when the thought took hold, slow and terrible. The warp had learned us. Not as a collective, not as a ship or a crew manifest, but individually. It had listened to our prayers, our arguments, our whispered fears in the dark. It had heard us call out to one another across centuries of drift, and now it answered. Not with mercy. With attention. The first time it addressed me directly. I was alone in the records bay. The lumen strips dimmed slightly, not enough to trigger an alert. The cogitators hummed at a lower pitch, their rhythm subtly wrong. I felt pressure behind my eyes, like hands pressing inward. Clerk, a voice said. It did not come from the vox. It came from everywhere. I froze, heart hammering so hard I thought it might tear free. I did not answer. I recited the litany of mental fortification silently, clinging to the words like a drowning man to wreckage. The voice chuckled. It sounded like paper sliding over paper, like ink drying. You keep us so well, it said. Names. Numbers, lives in order. My hands shook. I tasted metal. I am loyal, I whispered, though I did not know to whom I was speaking anymore. The pressure eased. The lights returned to normal. The cogitators resumed their usual hum. I was alone again, drenched in sweat, knees buckling as I collapsed into a chair. I did not file a report. Some truths cannot be stamped and survive. After that, I noticed changes in the records. Names appearing where none had been entered, designations subtly altered, dates shifting without authorization. I corrected them at first, assuming data corruption. But the changes returned, always slightly different, always precise enough to pass cursory inspection. The warp was editing us. I began to suspect the ship itself was complicit. Doors opened for people who no longer existed. Maintenance alerts triggered for systems no one remembered installing. Children spoke of friends who did not appear on any manifest, and yet those friends had bunks, tools, duties. I was ordered to add new designations. No explanation was given. Just names. Names I did not recognize, written in a hand that mimicked my own. I added them because refusal was unthinkable, because my survival depended on remaining useful. Each name added felt like an invitation. The sense of being kept grew stronger. We were no longer lost. We were curated. The warp did not want us to arrive anywhere else. It had invested too much time learning our habits, our faith, our routines. We were a closed system of devotion, labor, and despair, an endless hymn played out in flesh and bureaucracy. Why would it let us go? I saw it in the eyes of the children born aboard, how they stared into shadows without fear, how they answered voices that did not exist for me. They belonged to this place more than I ever could. The warp shaped them gently, patiently, the way a craftsman shapes material meant to last. Those who resisted, those who remembered too clearly vanished. I began to stop using names aloud. I referred to people by designation only. I avoided speaking of the dead. I erased personal notes from records, stripping entries down to function and number. If the warp fed on recognition, I would starve it as best I could. It did not matter. It already knew me. It knew how many forms I stamped per cycle. It knew my handwriting. It knew my voice when I prayed without believing. It knew my fear, my exhaustion, my resignation. I could feel its patience. That was the worst part. It did not rush. It did not threaten. It simply waited. Confident that time, rotted though it was, belonged to it now. The ship drifted on, full of whispers and half-seen shapes, crewed by people who no longer questioned why doors opened to empty corridors or why names appeared unbidden in the logs. We were being kept, catalogued, known. And once the warp knows your name, there is no forgetting it. I do not know what century it is. I do not know whether the Imperium still remembers the name of our ship, or whether that name was stamped onto a loss report long ago and buried beneath newer wars and fresher disasters. I do not know if the stars beyond the hull have changed position, if constellations have died and been reborn while we drifted in a place where maps are prayers and distance is a lie. What I know, what I can prove in ink and seal, is that I am still on the manifest. The record sits on a slate that has been recopied so many times the edges of the data feel worn, like parchment passed through too many hands. Crew status legend active, designation mine, duty track records and allocations, clearance restricted, intermediate, no Ts, operational, stable, continue assignment, stable. That word has become a kind of joke that no one laughs at anymore. There are days, if days exist, when I wake and my hands look older, veins raised like cables under thinning skin. Then I will blink, and the age will be gone, my fingers smoother, nails clean as if I have just joined the crew yesterday. I have stopped trying to measure it. Measurement is a trap. The ship punishes those who demand coherence. So I live inside procedure. I rise when the bell rings, even when the bell rings twice, even when it rings and then rings again from the wrong direction. I report to my station, even when the corridor seems longer than it was last shift, even when the bulkhead doors open with a sigh that sounds like someone breathing through teeth. I log what I am told to log. I stamp what requires stamping. I have become, in a way, the ship's heartbeat, repetitive, regulated, inescapable. The ship continues to drift, sustained by routine and denial. This vessel is a skeleton held together by paperwork and fear. Entire decks remain sealed, their loss filed as acceptable attrition and then forgotten, except by the occasional moan that travels through the hull in the middle of a night that might last an hour or a decade. The engines still thrum, ragged, exhausted, enduring not through repair but through sacrifice. Tech adepts still crawl through the shafts, chanting binary hymns to machines that no longer respond to logic, only to ritual. They keep the god machine breathing. We keep the god machine fed, and the warp keeps us. No rescue has come. That fact is not declared. It is simply demonstrated by absence. No astropathic reply. No docking lock engaged. No familiar pattern of translation procedures that ends with the sudden weight of real space returning, solid and unquestionable. Sometimes, messages do arrive. Orders from eras that make no sense. Commendations issued for battles we have not fought yet. Warnings of hazards already endured. We obey them, because obedience is easier than admitting that the chain of command has become a loop without origin. Once, long ago, or perhaps not long ago, I allowed myself to hope. A flicker of vox static resolved into a signal that sounded like a rescue hail, a real space pattern. The chapels overflowed. People cried openly. The priests preached gratitude so fierce it sounded like desperation. Officers rehearsed docking protocols with trembling hands. Then the signal became laughter, not human laughter. Not any sound meant for lungs. A distortion that made the teeth ache and the stomach turn, as if the very concept of rescue had been mimicked by something that had heard us speak of it often enough to imitate the shape. Hope died quietly that cycle. It was logged as morale fluctuation and addressed with increased chapel attendance requirements. Since then, denial has been our strongest armor. We do not speak of home anymore, not in words that invite attention. Those born aboard cannot imagine it. Those who remember have learned the price of speaking too clearly. We talk instead about duty schedules, ration adjustments, maintenance requests, things that can be stamped, quantified, controlled, yes. That is what we pretend. The truth is that the ship is no longer entirely ours. I have seen too many names appear in the ledgers without my writing them. I have watched dates rearrange themselves like nervous thoughts. I have heard the vents whisper my designation softly, approvingly, as if the vessel itself enjoys the act of being recorded. The warp likes ledgers. It likes lists. It likes the way we reduce ourselves to entries, the way we offer our lives up as neat lines of ink. The warp does not need our prayers when it can have our bureaucracy. It does not need our devotion when it can have our routine, our endless repetition of duty and death. I understand this now in a way I did not understand in the early years. To serve on a ship lost for centuries is not to die. Dying would be a conclusion. A release, a final stamp. This is worse. This is being endlessly recorded, endlessly useful, never allowed to arrive. Even death, aboard this ship, has become inconsistent. Some die and remain dead, their bodies recycled into protein, their names struck off the manifest cleanly. Others vanish without trace, their status changed to unaccounted, their bunks left untouched until reassigned. And some return, not as themselves. A woman once logged as deceased appeared again weeks later, walking the corridor outside the chapel with eyes that did not quite focus. Her designation was correct. Her voice was wrong. She performed her duties flawlessly, never speaking unless spoken to, never sleeping. When questioned, she replied with phrases from old Vox directives, as if her mind had been filled with archived orders. Command did not investigate. Command updated the manifest. I have stopped believing in endings. I have stopped believing in rescue. I believe only in the ledger. Because the ledger is the only thing that stays consistent enough to be trusted, and even that is changing under influences that do not require my permission. Still, I continue, because what else is there? If I refuse to log, I will be removed, not as punishment, not as spectacle, but as correction. If I speak too openly, the warp will listen more closely. If I cling to memories of real space, they will become bait, names, images, sensations that draw attention. So I keep my thoughts small, I keep my language procedural, I become what the ship and the warp both prefer a function. Sometimes, in the quiet between alarms, I imagine what it would be like to step onto a docking ramp into real space air, to feel sunlight, gravity, honest time. To hear a bell ring once and mean it, then I stop imagining. Imagination is dangerous here. The ship groans in the dark, a sound like an old throat clearing. The vents whisper softly, using my designation like a pet name. The lumen strips flicker, and shadows gather in corners that were never part of the original schematics. I open the ledger again. I confirm my status, active, still. This is my confession. Lost is a comforting word. It suggests the possibility of being found. We are not lost, we are kept. And as long as the manifest lists me as active crew, I will keep stamping, keep logging, keep serving, because the warp has patience measured in centuries, and the Imperium's bureaucracy has no mechanism for mercy, only continuation.